What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes, and in this video we are going to be comparing a bunch of different code examples from Svelte 4 to Svelte 5. We're going to be looking at stuff like states, reactivity, templates, on-mounts, unmounts, props, a bunch of different stuff that has changed. The goal of this video is to be an overview for all the different Svelte 5 stuff that is being added on top of Svelte 4. And for anyone who is not in the know, Svelte 5.0 has been officially released 8 hours ago. This isn't a beta, this isn't any weird test version, this is full release and you're able to use Svelte 5 in your application. It has been updated 2 more times since 8 hours ago, so we'll see how confident we are in the future. The main goal of this video is to be an overview, just to say that again, and so if you're expecting some super in-depth Svelte 5 technical analysis, I'll probably do that in a future video. This is supposed to be more casual and it's kind of targeted towards people that already know Svelte 4. So if you're a complete beginner, I'll probably make videos in the future for you, but this is more targeted towards people that are already using Svelte and are like, what is a state, rune? What even is this? So I'm just going to go through these examples one by one, give some commentary on them. And I'm also going to link this website in the description for anyone who's interested in seeing that. So the first things first here is that in Svelte 4, we had this very simple syntax where we could say let name is equal to John to declare variables. This has changed in Svelte 5. If we ever want to declare a state, we have to use this new thing called a state rune, which is defined as $state and then the value of the state on the inside of it. You'll see that using these values is the exact same. And so if we scroll down here into update state, we will then see that let name is equal to John and then name is equal to Jane is an example of changing the value of our state. Inside of Svelte 5, when we initially declare the state, we have to use the state rune with the John value. But when we change the name of the state, we can use the exact same syntax as we did before. So when we say name is equal to Jane, that 100% registers everything just like it did before. And so down here, it would say hello, Jane. And so that's an important thing to understand that we're going to see a lot here, is that when you have values that are going to change, you're likely going to use the state rune. So let's move on to reactivity, which is a really important part of Svelte, which has changed pretty significantly. So down here, we can see the computed state, and we can see that when we declare the count equal to 10 on the left here, we used to have this thing called a reactive statement that was defined with the $sign and then the colon. These reactive statements still exist, and by the way, everything is backwards compatible, just so you guys know. So you can still use a reactive statement, but the new suggested syntax is to use the derived rune. Derived does the exact same thing as what the reactive statement does over here. This isn't exactly a super in-depth example, but when you use $derived, what's going to happen is if any variable inside of here changes, for example, if the count variable were to change anywhere in your application, it would rerun the value of this double count. So if we were to change count to 30, it would then do 30 times 2 and give us a double count of 60. This is a pretty simple example of how we use derived, and there are going to be better examples in the future, but just know that derived is what's replacing the reactive statement. Again, that's a simple introduction to this, but that's kind of the point of this video. All right, guys, we get some easy ones. I know. Hello world is still hello world, so you got that to rely on. And as you guys will see, the styling is still the same. Nothing has changed to CSS. Classes are the same. Styles are the same, or the inline styles are the same. And then also these style tags are the same as well. We can scroll down here and you guys will be happy to learn that when we loop through arrays, or we just pretty much loop through any data, nothing has changed to looping. So your each statements with that syntax where you have the colors and then each color object that you're looping over, in this case it's red, green, blue, this syntax is exactly the same as to what it was before. So you don't have to worry about anything changing in terms of loops and also anything changing in terms of if statements, which we will probably see in a second here. Now we can talk about the very subtle change that has happened to the click event. So let's just introduce this code block real quick. We have a counter here, so you can imagine this, it's like shows counter of 0 initially. And then when you press on this little +1 button, it's going up here and count ++. So it's going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4 as you click on it, right? Try and see the differences between these two pieces of code because it's so subtle you might miss it. Hopefully you might have found it. but you'll see this on click right here is usually on colon click. And that's kind of a very familiar syntax we have in Svelte. They are actually changing that to just be on click with a lowercase c. So to handle on click events, you just say on click instead of on colon click. This is also another good example on the right here of using state. This is a pretty good rule to follow, but when you want the variable to change or its value is going to change, use state. Pretty simple. And because it's treated just like a normal variable, you can do count plus plus, and that's still going to change the value of the variable. You don't have to do any strange state-related syntax there. All right, guys, so now we have the DOM reference. This is using onMount, by the way, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. If you want to bind the input element to a certain input, you just say bind colon this, and then the input element. On the right side, you have the input element right here, and then you say bind colon this, input element. We'll talk about onMount versus effect in a second. So if you guys are confused about that syntax, don't worry, there's a better example below. But first things first, we are going to talk about this conditional example, which is a bit more complicated, so let's talk about it real quick. You can see that we have the traffic lights at the top here as an array, and they're red, orange, and green. And this code is pretty much showing you which traffic light you're at. So it's going to show you stop if it's red, slow down if it's orange, and then green if it's go. And we have a little button at the top of our lights here that lets us go to the next light. And so when we press on next light, it's going to call this next light function. This is pretty much doing some syntax where it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, so the value never goes out of range. If you guys don't know what this thing is, it's technically the modulus operator. If you don't know what that is, I wouldn't even worry about it. It's not related to Svelte 4 versus Svelte 5, to be honest. But the interesting thing that's happening here is when this light changes to the next light, it's actually triggering this reactive statement right here. And this is a really good example as to how the reactivity is changing in Svelte 5. Is if we go over to the right here, we see that we have the traffic lights and we have the light index, which is now stored in a state. Initially it's 0, so it's going to be telling you to stop initially, or it's going to be red. And just like in the other example, we have this on click with no colon, and we're going to click it to go to the next light. This light index has the exact same syntax in how it changes, but you guys will see the light is not a reactive statement, it's instead a derived statement. This is a perfect example that this derived statement is going to get rerun when any of the values inside of this statement change. So a good one here being if the light index changes, it's then going to recalculate the traffic lights. So if it's initially traffic lights of 0, it's going to be red. If we go to the next light and it's traffic lights of 1, this is going to rerun and become orange. This is really important because it's a good example of this derived statement pretty much being the new reactivity. That's a relatively basic introduction into how this is working. One last thing in this example, because I do know it's kind of complicated, is that when this derived value gets updated, it is also going to change your if statement down here. This is a larger example, but that's kind of all I want to say about this one. So let's keep going. All right, so now we can talk about the lifecycle logic. So this is stuff like on mount and on destroy. So when a component mounts and when a component unmounts. So let's just get familiar with this code example. We can see that it is a relatively simple example where it's showing page title and then the actual title of the page you're on. When the component gets mounted, it's going to say page title is equal to document.title, and it's setting this variable up here. You will see that inside of Svelte 5, we actually do not use onMount at all. The thing that is replacing onMount is the effect rune. So the effect rune works very similarly to onMount, where it has a function that I'm highlighting right here, and this function gets ran when the component gets mounted. Effects are very similar to React, the React use effect. If you're not familiar with React, no worries at all. Just know that it runs just like the onMount function. And so when the component gets mounted, it's going to run the effect, and then it's going to run all the logic in the effect, for example, setting the page title equal to the document.title. So now let's talk about the opposite of onMount, which is the onUnmount, or as we know it in Svelte, the onDestroy. So on the left here is an example where we have a timer. When the component mounts, we start our timer, and pretty much it's going to be like a watch. It's going to say every single second, update the time. And so every second, as defined here, is going to update the time with the latest time. When the component gets unmounted or destroyed, it's then going to run this function to clear the interval. And so that's how we used to do things in Svelte 4. You'll see we don't even use the onMount in this Svelte 4 example at all, which is a little bit different because over in Svelte 5, we actually do use the effect. A really important part of effect is that it has the ability to return a function that gets ran when the component unmounts. So this return function right here, you'll see, is very similar to our onDestroy. That's because when the component unmounts or when the component gets destroyed, it's going to run whatever logic is defined by this function here. I much prefer this new syntax. I always found onMount and onDestroy to be a bit confusing, but this effect syntax is more simple in my opinion. You're always going to have the effect, which you know is always going to run when the component gets mounted, and effect has the ability, by the way, it's not required, to return a function to run the onDestroy logic. This type of syntax is also nice because imagine you have a bunch of logic written at the top of your effect here. If you ever wanted to create some new onDestroy logic, all you have to do is just go in here, type return, and then make a function for whatever logic you want. You don't have to worry about importing an onDestroy. You don't have to worry about your onDestroy being in a certain location. All you do is make a return function for your effect. So that is a quick overview of the onUnmounts and effects and how they work. Let's scroll down into component composition here. Most importantly, how props work. So in this coding example, we have this user profile with a bunch of properties. It has a name of John, age of 20, favorite colors, green, blue, red, and if they're available or not. You can see that in Svelte 5, this is the exact same syntax. But don't be so fast, there's actually a pretty significant change. If we actually go into the user profile component, we'll see that inside of here we have export let name, export let age, which is the syntax that we're familiar with from Svelte 4. Over in Svelte 5, that completely changes. Instead, we use the props rune. And so the props rune is the new way for you to define properties for your components. It uses a syntax where you say const and then an object, and then you define properties with the name of the property, and then this equal sign shows the default value of the property. And if you don't want a default value, you can just say, let's say only name, and you don't need the equals an empty string. So this is a pretty significant change in how the props have worked, but one thing that I kind of glossed over here is that how properties actually work inside of your application in terms of showing the values or using the values is the exact same. You'll see that from Svelte 4 to Svelte 5, we can run functions on them. We can run methods on our properties just like that. We can even run conditional logic on our properties like this. Super simple. And so we'll see a bunch of different props examples in the future here, but it's just good to know that the props rune like this is the recommended way of using props from here on. All right, so let's talk about this next example. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I almost don't want to talk about this example, so I'm really going to gloss over it. Pretty much there is an answer button where it says, are you happy? And you can say yes or no. This is a tragic component, okay? I'm just going to be real. But if you ever use these on events where you see answer button on yes or on no, you'd have to do this weird syntax where you use something called the event dispatcher. Remember, this logic is technically not deprecated, but just take a look at what's happening in Svelte 5. Remember, guys, the exact same syntax on each side here, besides the $state, I suppose. But instead, what's happening is on yes and on no are just passed in as functions, and the actual answer button is significantly more simple. As you guys can see, this is an example of passing functions in as a property, and you literally just call the function on click, just like you did over here. Long story short, your life is way easier in Svelte 5 if you ever had to deal with the event dispatcher. So let's go down to something that I believe is a bit more important for you guys to know about, is how slots work. Okay, so slot is an incredibly important part of how Svelte works. Slots allow you to use the children of your components. So for example, we have this funny button component right here, and it has this syntax click me on the middle of it, or inside of it, I should say. This funny button.svelte then has a button with some syntax, and then a slot on the inside. And so this slot here is then going to get replaced with the children here. You'll see in Svelte 5, there are some pretty significant changes as to how that is happening. So if we go to the right and go to the funny button.svelte over here, we're instead using the children that we get access to from props. If you're familiar with React, this is a very React way of doing things, just for what it's worth. Again, if you don't know React, no worries at all. But instead what's happening is it's getting access to the click me right here through the children. So this is the parent, and anything on the inside is defined as the children. And so if we get access to the children, we're pretty much saying at render the children, which is then click me. And so I wouldn't worry too much about what at render is doing besides knowing that it is replacing what slot does. Now we can go to the next example here, which is talking about the slot fallback. So let's move on to the slot fallback here, and we can see we have a code example where we're using the funny button again. You will see that we have this funny button.svelte, and inside of the funny button.svelte there's a slot, and there's actually something inside the slot that says no content found. So this span right here is going to show up if the funny button has no children. So for example, right here, the funny button gets closed right away. No children from this one. So it's going to then show the no content found right here. Inside of Svelte 5, we have a bit of a different syntax. So you'll see components used the exact same way, children shown the exact same way. In the funny button.svelte though, we then use the children right here. And children is going to return a truthy or a falsy value, meaning that if it's empty, it's going to be false. So we can do the syntax here where it says if children, render the children, else show no content found. And so this is the preferred new syntax for this. And honestly, I believe it makes much more sense. This old slot syntax was kind of unclear. People didn't know if this was going to show up alongside their children or, they just didn't know. And so the main takeaway from this one is that you can use the children object conditionally, and inside this conditional, you can just have an else statement to show that no data or no children found case. All right, guys, the next example here is going to be context. I'm going to start this by just being real with you guys. Context is something you cannot explain in 2 minutes, okay? If you're really a beginner to context and how stores and states work in Svelte, this is definitely not the video for that, just to be honest. And so I'm going to explain this very lightly, which I hope you guys don't get mad at me for, okay? Inside of Svelte 4, we have this create user store, which is handling a bunch of user data in this little example. And inside of Svelte 5, we have the create user state, which is also handling the data. We're using this thing called set context, which sets the user key equal to the store in Svelte 4, and the user key equal to the user state in Svelte 5. That's the main difference, is how we handle these user stores or these user states. And so we can go look and see how the user store is made in Svelte 4 compared to how the user state is made in Svelte 5. So the main pattern you guys want to get away from how context works and how the stores versus states work is that in stores, we are using writables. So inside of Svelte 4, we are using writables. It's a lot of what we do. But inside of Svelte 5, you're going to change a lot of your code to then use states. I don't want to say anything too broadly here because the states and how you can return the different values that your state has access to, it can change. I know that's kind of a vague thing to say, but these are really kind of tools for you to use for your individual state. In this scenario, the person has a username, and this ... initial is all the values that are coming in from this object right here. So their ID, their username, their email. So you can do new things like getters and setters inside of these user states. For example, when someone gets the value of username, you can just return username. When someone sets the value of username, you can define that logic here as well. And we can see how this logic can be different. I know this is a very vague way of describing it, but if we look at how the username is updated here, which is the set username, versus on the left here, we return some update username function. If we go to the user profile, on the left in Svelte 4 land, you do user store.update username. But on the right, you do username is equal to Jane. And so that's kind of the main difference between Svelte 4 and Svelte 5 is that Svelte 4 has these stores, which are pretty much writables. And then Svelte 5 has these states, which can be manipulated just like states where you say user.username is equal to Jane. I'm kind of being vague in my explanation, which I don't like to do a lot of the times, but this is more of an overview for the syntax and what to look out for. One last distinction between these two code examples that's really important to understand is that this user store has a subscribe method that it returns. Because you need to subscribe to get the active value, you have to say $userstore.username, $userstore.email. This is because you're getting the current subscribed value of that store. Inside of Svelte 5, you don't have to do the $. There's no listening to the active value. This user.username is going to update on its own. And that's because it is using the update function from the state here. Again, guys, this is a very overarching kind of explanation. I'm going to make entire videos on context versus stores, when to use either, because technically you still have access to writables. There are a bunch of random things specifically related to context. So if my explanation just sucked, I'm sorry. But let's move on to, more simple things real quick. I don't really want to waste your guys' time here, so I'm just going to say this much. Form inputs are pretty much the same for the most part. You do the bind : value is equal to a certain value. Instead, in Svelte 5, it is the state with a certain value, and then you do bind : value is equal to the state. Just like it worked before, you don't have to worry about any new binding logic at all. Same exact thing down here. If you're using a checkbox, bind checked, same thing. Just make sure that it's a state right here and you're good to go. So for radio inputs, everything is the exact same. And so we can do bind group is equal to picked, where picked is something up here. In Svelte 5, it's the same thing. It just has to be a state. I know I sound like a broken record saying the same thing over and over. Finally, even in a select, so this would be like selecting from a list of things, you have the exact same thing happen. You can just have a selected color ID as a $state, and then you can bind the value to the select. Exact same thing, and honestly, you guys don't have to worry about this. That's why I'm not taking too much time on it at all. All right, so there are some more examples below this that I'm not going to show off. Long story short, they changed how the rendering of the app works. And then at the very end, there is an example of an API request. You guys can go to the link in the description of this website I'm using if you want to go check it out yourself. But this is the entire video. I just wanted to create a video with some commentary showcasing the differences between Svelte 4 and Svelte 5 to help people kind of change over to Svelte 5. Now that Svelte 5 is finally out to the public, I thought I'd make this video to help some other people out. So hopefully this video helped you out and it exposed you to the syntax differences, and hopefully you'll be back at this channel or just back out there building your Svelte 5 applications. Thanks so much for watching.